Hello everyone, my name is Andrés, and today I'm going to be talking about the threat model of injection attacks on password managers. So as we're all aware, password-based authentication suffers from many common pitfalls. So password managers have become the default solution to this problem, as users can offload to them many of the complexities of good password health, such as generating strong passwords, storing and autofilling them at a later time, and even synchronizing them across devices. The intended threat model of password managers is that a malicious or breached application server cannot read nor manipulate the plaintext messages. So the basic end-to-end encrypted threat model that we're all familiar with. So due to their sensitive nature, password managers have been the source of much academic attention. And broadly speaking, the threat model started by prior work can be divided into two categories. On one hand, we have adversaries that acquire a copy of the user's encrypted data. And they perform, for example, local password cracking attacks. Then on the other hand, we have attackers that control a client-side resource, such as a malicious website that the victim is tricked into accessing, or a rogue application in the victim's device, or perhaps even the Wi-Fi network itself. So as a result of all this work, modern password managers are designed to resist these types of attacks. So we have a pretty robust understanding of these classes of threat models. However, in recent years, we've seen new trends in the development of password managers. In particular, password managers are becoming increasingly complex and feature-rich, providing a multitude of features beyond just password generation and storage. This fact motivates the need to revisit the threat models that we studied password managers through. So the main contribution of this work is to introduce a new threat model for password managers, which we call injection attacks. This new class of attacks is inspired by this trend of increasing application complexity. So to understand the relevance of this threat model, we analyzed 10 case study applications through the lens of injection attacks. And our analysis uncovered 4 general examples of attacks, which serves as evidence that this threat model is of practical concern. So before explaining our threat model and attacks, I'm briefly going to go over some basic background on password managers. So in this setting, the user has a device with a client for a password manager installed, through which they can add and store credentials, log into websites, and so on. And these passwords are stored in the device in the form of a local vault, which is generally some simple file format like XML or a list of JSON objects, which each of these encrypted individually. And then periodically, the client sends these credentials to the application servers in order to, say, synchronize its state across multiple devices or perform backups of the credentials, and so on. So to achieve their end-to-end security guarantees, credentials are encrypted when they leave the device using a key that's only known to the user and that is derived from their so-called master password. So at first, it may seem like this is the full picture. However, as I alluded to earlier, password managers now support a number of other features. For example, many of them have support for storing files in the vaults, maybe as attachments and credentials, computing comprehensive security metrics, such as the number of duplicate passwords or a strength score for each password. Maybe these metrics are forwarded to an organization administrator, and so on. And they even have very rich user interfaces showing icons for the websites of the credentials you have stored. And a particularly interesting feature supported by many password managers is that of credential sharing. So with this feature, users can send credentials to each other, granting read or write access, and they can even establish shared folders that they both have access to. So maybe a family wants to have a family folder where they put their Netflix accounts or the Spotify accounts, and so on. And in these cases, the shared credentials are stored in both vaults and synchronized by the application servers automatically. So whenever an endpoint makes any changes to a shared folder, let's say, these are going to be automatically propagated to all devices that have access to these. So a key idea of our threat model is that while we used to think of password managers as non-interactive applications, novel features like credential sharing require us to rethink this mental model. In particular, what happens when the victim is interacting with other malicious application clients? Does, for example, having shared credentials with a victim potentially open the door to new attacks? So these questions are the starting point for a threat model. This brings us to the notion of injection attacks. Our threat model is underpinned by 2 key assumptions. First, an adversary that can observe some form of protected application state that leaves the device. So maybe this is a malicious application server that can see the encrypted credentials and benign metadata that's logged in the servers, Or maybe this is a network adversary that's observing the HTTPS traffic between the client and the server. So kind of the basic end-to-end encrypted threat model. Then we additionally assume that the adversary can interact with the victim and send payloads through the standard unmodified interface provided by the application client. So these payloads are received by the victim client and added to its internal application state. For example, the adversary can share credentials with the victim, which are then incorporated into the vault. So the adversary can coordinate observations and injections adaptatively by sharing a credential, observing the resulting application state, which then informs the next credential to share, and so on, with the aim of backing out confidential information. And of course, we know that the first assumption should not be sufficient to learn any sensitive information, since these applications are using strong cryptographic primitives, and this is kind of the end-to-end encrypted threat model. So what we're asking is what happens when we allow this extra degree of freedom of injecting information into this application state. And the key idea behind these types of attacks is that this application state is in fact the result of complex application logic that's taking payloads from different sources, some benign, some potentially adversarial, and combining it in ways that may lead to side channel leakage of information. So to study this threat model, we first built a corpus of password managers to analyze their security. And we started by putting together a list of multiple candidate password managers based on online sources like Reddit polls and market shares of password managers. So then we filtered these applications based on 2 criteria. First, we wanted applications that support credential sharing, since this is, of course, the injection channel that gives rise to our attacks. So this eliminated browser-integrated password managers, since many of them, or actually most of them, or all of them, I should say, don't have support for, say, like shared folders and so on, at least not yet. And the second criteria is that we only cared about applications that enforce cryptographic access control for shared credentials. So this eliminated, in particular, Bitwarden, since in their context of sharing, sharing is only enforced at the authorization level, not at the cryptographic level. So within an organization, it turns out that all credentials are encrypted using the same secret key, quite surprisingly. So people that don't have access to credentials in a particular folder can decrypt them if they have access to the encrypted payloads. So the final list is the one that's shown on the screen, which accounts for 30% of password manager users, at least to a particular market share report from security.org. And the reason why this number is not larger is because browser password managers are a big chunk of this market share, of course. So now I'm going to summarize the findings of our security analysis, which, as I said earlier, are kind of examples of this broader threat model. So we uncovered 4 general attack vectors. First, these metrics of like the health of the credentials yield a side channel that can be leveraged to perform an efficient credential spoofing attack. In addition, URL icons that are shown in the UI are cached and reused by the client, which can be used to find whether the victim has an account with a particular website or not. And lastly, some password managers use storage saving mechanisms like file deduplication and compression of the vaults before encryption, which had led to attack in other domains. So I'm not going to talk about the first attack for the interest of time, and then I'll briefly comment on the other 2. So as I mentioned earlier, a common feature of password managers is to compute metrics about the overall health of a user's vault, in particular the number of reused credentials that are present in the vault. And 2 important facts about these metrics is that first, they're computed across both personal and shared credentials. So if you have the same password in a shared credential and in a personal credential, this adds a 1 to the tally of duplicate passwords. And then a second fact is that these are often logged outside the device to the application servers or maybe an organization administrator. Sometimes they're encrypted, sometimes they're logged in plain text, but often they're exported from the device. And in a threat model, this exposes a simple side channel to an adversary through which they can verify whether a password is in the victim's vault or not. So say that the adversary wants to tell whether a particular candidate password is in the victim's vault. All they can do is to first observe the original number of duplicate passwords, then just share the candidate password, which in this case doesn't match anything else in the vault. So the next log of duplicates will be the same as before. Conversely, if they share a password that does match something in the vault, the next log of duplicates will increase by 1, confirming that this password was indeed already present in the vault. As such, this is a simple example of a cross-user interaction of data through which an adversary can confirm the presence of a password in the vault by looking at fluctuations in the number of logged duplicate passwords. And this can be leveraged to perform an efficient credential spoofing attack. So what the adversary can do is to use a binary search injection strategy to traverse the list of candidate passwords efficiently. So what they do is that they take half the list of candidate passwords and then share all of these at once. And then one or two things can happen. If the number of duplicate password increases by 1, we know that the password is somewhere in this first half. We don't know which one it is, but it's somewhere there. Conversely, if it doesn't increase by 1, we know that if there's a target password, it's in the other half of the list of candidate passwords. So from there, we know which half to recurse into, which allows us to perform this logarithmic speedup on the credential spoofing attack. And I want to point out that here I described the attack when the metrics are in plain text just for clarity of presentation, but our attack in fact can be modified to work when, say, the client is encrypting the metrics before logging them in the application server. I was going to say a bit about that, but I think I'm running low on time, so we can chat about that later if anyone's interested. And a second point is that credential spoofing attacks are surprisingly a relevant adversarial goal even for password manager users. And indeed, prior work and user studies has found that it's not uncommon for users of password managers to have weak credentials in their vault. For example, maybe they imported credentials into their vault when they started using it and never updated them, or maybe they use a password manager for convenience instead of security reasons, say for autofilling passwords. And in general, security should not degrade beyond just standard brute force search at the website endpoints. And from the applications we studied, 5 were vulnerable to this attack. And I should note that, however, that this is sort of a general attack that relies on like generic preconditions, so other applications could, in principle, be vulnerable to it. And I'm just going to very briefly comment on the other attacks. So as I mentioned earlier, another common feature of password managers is to show a small icon next to each credential, identifying the domain that it's for. And it turns out that these icons are cached and reused by the client across all vault credentials. So if you add a password for google.com, this triggers a network request to fetch that particular icon. But if you add another credential for Google, the icon is just reused from what's stored on the client. So this presents another side channel to an adversary, where if they share a password for a particular domain with the victim, one of two things can happen. Either this triggers a network request to fetch the icon, meaning that that particular URL is not in the vault, or no new network request is triggered, implying that the icon was cached and reused by the client. So via that, they can determine whether the victim has particular accounts with specific URLs, for specific URLs. Yeah, I should note that for this particular attack, a network adversary is sufficient since, of course, we only care whether a request is triggered or not by the client, but the actual payload of the request is not necessary for this attack. We may need additional traffic analysis techniques, hence why I put an asterisk there. But in general, a network adversary that's just observing HTTPS traffic is sufficient. So from the applications we studied, 6 were vulnerable to this attack. Yeah. And then we also identified that one of the password managers we studied supports vault compression and deduplication, which it's well known that these can lead to vulnerabilities in the face of adversarial inputs. However, this is the first work to show that this is also the case for password managers. Now that we're considering this password sharing as sort of an injection channel. And I should note, however, that for the application where we show these attacks, which is keep_as_xc, the vault compression and deduplication are in fact part of the its file format, which is KDBX4, and not part of the kind of specific application keep_as_xc. And this file format is used by many other password managers that are derivatives of the original keep_as app. So other password managers who support credential sharing and use this file format could be vulnerable to it. And just to wrap up, some mitigations, there's kind of, just to say a few for each, for both vault health metrics and vault compression and deduplication, kind of the easiest mitigation is to namespace these respectively. So only compute metrics, say, for personal credentials, and then compute duplicate passwords separately for each shared folder. And then for URL icons, you could consider retrieving URL icons every time, even if you're just sending a dummy request, but ultimately storing one in the client. And in the last 30 seconds, just to say a little bit about the responsible disclosure. So we disclose this to all the vendors, even though, as I said earlier, these are sort of generic attack templates, really. And most of them deployed either full or partial mitigations. In the paper, we kind of break this down. Many of them adopted or suggested mitigations. Others adopted partial mitigations, such as adding noise or rate limiting the sharing endpoints, and so on. But in general, most of the vendors acknowledged the vulnerabilities and deployed some sort of mitigations. And just to wrap up, really the main contribution of the work, more than the attacks, is the threat model and this notion that interaction with adversarial clients can lead to vulnerabilities, which we've seen in other domains, and it's sort of a trend coming up in end-to-end encrypted applications. And it's also the case for password managers. So we need kind of more principled study of this threat model and detection and mitigation mechanisms for injection attacks. And I think I'm 7 seconds out of time, so thank you very much.